Stop right now. Think about the last time you wrote an essay about a poem or a story and you felt like you were just guessing, like you were just throwing literary devices around on the page, hoping that something would stick. What if I told you that 90% of students who struggle with literary analysis don't have poor reading comprehension, they just don't have a systematic way of writing about literary devices, like metaphors and similes? Hi, I'm Dr. Clay Zuba, inventor of Zubify. Today, I'm going to show you a way of understanding the mechanics of metaphors and similes in a way that will transform not only your reading, but your writing. Yes! Welcome to my series on interpreting your reading through writing, where I take one literary device and I show you how understanding how that literary device works can level up both your reading and your writing. Today, we're focusing on metaphors and similes. You probably learned to recognize metaphors and similes when you were very young, in the 4th grade, maybe even kindergarten, maybe even when you were in day school. What? But writing about metaphors and similes is not as easy as identifying them, because you need to show your comparison in a systematic way that allows your reader to see how you think about them and interpret them. If you can't write about metaphors and similes effectively yet, that might not be your fault. Maybe no one ever taught you. That's okay. That's why I'm here. I'm Dr. Zuba. You know who I am. Now, metaphors and similes both make comparisons between two unlike objects or ideas. In the simile, the comparison is obvious because it contains the word like or as. In a metaphor, the comparison is implied because there's no word like or as, and the sentence creates equivalence between the two unlike objects. Now, when Taylor Swift sings "Can We Be a Home" in her brilliant song, "It's Time to Go," she's comparing her and her partner's relationship to a home. She wants her and her partner to unite in a metaphorical home, meaning she wants her and her partner to be a place of comfort and shelter and family and cats and everything else you would associate with a home. When one of my favorite bands, Trash Can Sinatra, sings "You Came Into My Life Like a Brick Through a Window," this is a simile that compares someone entering another person's life to a brick flying through a window. It contrasts the expectation of pleasure in a new romance with the sudden violence and crashing and destruction of a brick through a window. During this video, I'm just going to refer to both of these comparisons as metaphors, and we can worry about the differences later at the end of this video. They matter, but they're not as important for understanding the structure and how to think about these two devices. So for now, let's concentrate on how to think about metaphors and similes and how to write about them. Yes. The first step in writing and thinking about metaphors and similes is to identify the parts. Metaphors and similes are both composed of two basic parts, the tenor and the vehicle. In our Taylor Swift metaphor, "Can we be a home?" the home is the vehicle and the we is the tenor. In other words, the main thing being compared is the tenor, and what it's being compared to is the vehicle. In my Trash Can Sinatra's example, "You came into my life like a brick through a window," you is the tenor, and a brick through a window is the vehicle. The tenor is something that is familiar, but it's made new and different through comparison through the vehicle. The new quality that the tenor gains through comparison to the vehicle, and the quality that is transferred from the vehicle to the transfer, is called the ground. And the amount of difference between the tenor and the vehicle is called the tension. Yes. The ground in our Taylor Swift example was the quality of a home as a shelter or a place of comfort and a place for cats. The ground in our TCS comparison, that's Trash Can Sinatra's, is the violence and sudden destruction and crashing and mayhem of a brick through a window. These two comparisons have different amounts of tension. There's not that much tension, really, between the we and a home in Taylor Swift's comparison. The reader's mind can kind of accept this comparison without too much struggle. But there is a lot of tension between the phrase "you came into my life" and "like a brick through a window" in the Trash Can Sinatra's example. This high amount of tension would surprise a reader. It might emphasize and bring that comparison into really vivid understanding in a reader's mind, but it also might be a little bit tricky to understand and explain, making it possibly unpersuasive if the reader doesn't immediately understand it. Good metaphors have the right amount of tension. They work well because they transfer qualities from the vehicle to the tenor in the reader's mind kind of effortlessly, and they use the vehicle to teach something new to the reader about the tenor. Understanding in writing about metaphors isn't so much about identifying the parts and naming them, it's being able to distinguish them from another, and that allows us to think about them. Once you've got the parts of this metaphor or simile identified, now you can start to ask questions about them, and that is step 2, ask questions. Here's a list of some questions you might ask about this metaphor once you've identified the parts. What is my everyday understanding of the tenor? What's my understanding of the vehicle? What qualities might the vehicle and the tenor share? That's going to be your ground, because that's going to be the quality transferred from the vehicle to the tenor, which leads to one of the really important questions then is, how does this metaphor change my understanding of the tenor? You should also think about the amount of tension, because that influences 2 things. One is how persuasive this metaphor or simile is going to be, and the other is just kind of how much explaining you're going to do. For a metaphor with a lot of tension, you're going to have to explain more than one without a lot of tension, because it's going to be harder for the reader to understand your interpretation of this metaphor. Step 3, then, is to think about how this metaphor works in part of a larger purpose of a literary work. Ask, what purpose does this metaphor serve in this work? Does it work in conjunction with another literary device, maybe even, like irony or hyperbole or symbolism? You'll see this a lot if you're interpreting and analyzing fiction and poetry. If you're reading nonfiction, you'll want to ask, does this metaphor work persuasively as part of an argument? And how does it work persuasively? Does it work on an emotional level or an illogical level or a level of establishing credibility? I don't know. That's going to be up to you in the individual work and the way you read it. Yes. We're going to go back to our poem, Recuerdo by Edna St. Vincent Millay. Yes. We studied this poem a little bit initially in the first video on this series, which was about writing about imagery. If you want to learn more about this poem, as well as understand how to write about imagery, you should go back to the first video in this series, and I'm going to link it below in the description. But in that poem, Edna St. Vincent Millay was trying to describe a relationship between 2 lovers, and she described it using a ferry ride as a kind of an extended metaphor that contained a great deal of imagery. Here's one of the metaphors in Millay's poem. She writes, "And the sun rose dripping like a bucket full of gold." In this metaphor, as is probably kind of easy to see, the rising sun is the tenor, and a dripping bucket full of gold is the vehicle. If I don't immediately see the ground or the tension, now I might start to ask questions that can help me understand them. My understanding of a rising sun is something that happens every day that we often think of as beautiful, and it is literally gold. A lot when we see it visually. A dripping bucket full of gold is something that I would understand as transferring wealth, because gold is often a symbol of wealth, and it literally does have monetary value. And if it's dripping, it's overflowing. There's a lot of it. I might ask then, what qualities are being transferred from this vehicle to the tenor? In this case, it's going to be probably symbolic, because you can't literally dump gold on a new day. The sun wouldn't do that. And in terms of the purpose then, there's an implication here to the reader that this narrator, when they see this rising sun, they're seeing it dripping. In one sense, this might be literal, because they might be seeing kind of like, the way you see a sunrise when there's maybe a little bit of blurriness underneath the sun because of the amount of moisture or pollution in the atmosphere. They're seeing this not only visually, but they're seeing this internally. They're viewing the new day, which is kind of a mundane thing. That's a special thing, a new promise of immense inner wealth and inner fertility, even, because it might symbolize inner growth in this relationship for both people. I've now just walked you through all 4 steps of analyzing this metaphor. Now I can show you how I'd write about it. In step 5, write. Yes! What I hope you'll notice here, when you see the way I'm writing about this, the first thing I hope you'll notice is that writing about this metaphor took a lot more space on the page than it took for the poet to write the metaphor itself. If you're having trouble explaining and elaborating about why you're interpreting a metaphor or a simile in a certain way, you can use this paragraph as an example. And as you'll see, I've got all my parts of the metaphor in this description. I've bolded them for you. When I'm writing here about the rising sun, I'm identifying the tenor. When I'm writing about this container overflowing with gold, I'm identifying the vehicle for my reader. I'm then showing my everyday understanding of these two different objects. I'm identifying here in bold the amount of tension that we've got between the two parts of the metaphor. And I'm then going on a little bit here to write about the way I am understanding the vehicle transferring value to the tenor. And here then I'm describing the ground when I write about the shared quality between the two objects as the brilliant golden color, as well as the symbolic immense value that we would place on gold in our culture. I'm then writing about my understanding of the purpose of this metaphor. I'm saying, based on this metaphor, the sun symbolizes inner wealth and warmth. The metaphor implies that the narrator views the day shared between the two people with a promise of inner warmth and spiritual richness. So you can see here then that I've ended this paragraph on the purpose of the metaphor in the literary work overall. And that's how you analyze and write about a metaphor in a work of poetry. Yes. Now, poetry metaphors are beautiful, but here's where it gets really powerful. When writers use similes to change the course of history. In part 2, I'm going to show you how Martin Luther King used one simple simile to make racial justice feel inevitable to an entire nation. The technique is exactly the same, but the impact? Revolutionary.